You're all extreme programs, of course, aren't you? Okay, so this was going to be a talk about hexagonal architecture. It's a lightning talk. I've only got 10 minutes, so I've shaved off a sign, so we should fit it in.
Oh, we get it.
Thank you. Thank you. So, pentagonal, hexagonal, it gets some attention. Recently, it's been mentioned in a few places. A couple of my favourite publications. Goose talked about it. Anyone who's familiar with the Implementing DDD book and all the stuff that surrounds that, all the blogging and talking around that, hexagonal comes up. And of course, who can forget is TDD dead? Came up in that discussion as well, with DHH being particularly dismissive of it for good reasons. So if we go back to the beginning then, so we've been through a bit of a functional trip, haven't we? We're going back to objects now. Sorry. And things start like this, monolithic. No one's got a care in the world because we've got a terminal, we've got a server, and we've got some information flow, bidirectional. But we've got a dependency direction. The terminal has to know something about the server. That's the old world. So someone decided that business logic would be the important thing to concentrate on. It's where all the interesting stuff happens for an organization, so let's get the developers thinking about business logic. So if it's really that important, we should consider encapsulating it, perhaps breaking it out. So the N-tier template came along, which is the next sort of historical milestone. Same thing again, information flow, all the way down, all the way up. And unsurprisingly, the order of dependency is going down. So your user interface needs to know about your business logic. Your business logic needs to know about persistence. It tends to be this emphasis on persistence. So then an SOA type person comes along and says, well, this domain logic should possibly be shared, encapsulated not only in components but in services, and knock yourself out, generate as many services as you like, and if those services start to acquire bits of domain logic, then fine, you just start to acquire it, and developers are quite happy to stick their domain logic into services. And of course, that domain logic gets mixed in with lots of other stuff like handling requests and responses and all that kind of stuff, and mapping everywhere. But again, the dependency direction tends to be clients need to know about services. Services tend to need to know about each other, and services again seem to have this obsession with persistence. So there's a lot of arrows in this presentation, and the ones at the beginning were all about information flow, so data flow between parts of your system. These arrows are all about how dependencies go. So the direction in which you depend on something. So if we go back to the N-tier model that was kindly invented for us, the order of dependencies downwards. So where does the really interesting stuff happen in your code, in your solution? Persistence is a concern. User interfaces are a concern. N-tier says domain logic gets a tune. Domain logic is the important thing. So what are we going to do? How are we going to focus on where the value in the business is? Now brace yourselves, there's going to be some flashy graphics. But Did you spot the difference? Something's changed. So I've decided that if the domain is of such critical importance to what I do, then I'm going to ask the user interface and the persistence aspects of what I do to depend on the domain and not the other way around. So let's focus on the domain. Everything's looking at the domain. That's where all the interesting stuff happens. So we put it central to what we do. And when we do that, we want to keep it from becoming corrupted by external influences and dependencies. But what happens when our user interface in our database? We can't simply say, well, we've got a domain, that's where all our interesting, valuable stuff goes. We've still got to service stuff to the customers, and we've still got to persist stuff. So with this dependency direction in place, the domain now insists that if any external system is going to interact with it, it has to use a port. So our user interface comes back in a port. Our database comes back in a port. Okay, so there are no other ports illustrated here. I'll come to those in a bit. We need to talk about what exactly goes into ports, why we've ended up pushing stuff out into them. So if we get specific then, hexagonal architecture is also known as ports and adapters. That's the other term that we tend to use. So here's a port. Here's a port. Controller is an adapter. It's concerned with adapting anything that is going to go into the domain into something that the domain can cope with and is happy to deal with. The other end of the hexagon is a data reader, which if we zoom out, we can see is dealing with another outside influence, which is, in this example, SQL Server. And this is where we start to see the dependency direction going out from the center of the hexagon. So we've got data readers which know something about the domain, we've got controllers which know something about the domain, but they also have to understand all the vagaries of the web browser and the SQL Server, or the web server, if you like. So they're adapting non-domain things into domain things. They're implementing their own kind of bounded contexts and acting as little anti-corruption layers, so that, for example, in the controller, nothing related to cookies or requests or anything like that is going to get anywhere near the domain, because the controller is going to get hold of it first and going to squish it down into the domain. And on the other end of it, the data reader is going to isolate the domain from anything to do with connections, transactions, users, anything like that. So how can things just work then if we've said the domain is a central thing, controllers are adapters, data readers are adapters? How can all of this suddenly magically plug together and work? Why would we even do it this way? So how, for example, would persistence work without it being invoked explicitly and imperatively? So if the domain is changing state throughout its use. So, for example, a user logs into websites, requests a page, and the controller says, okay, well, we need to tell the domain to go and fetch some stuff. How is any of that interesting stuff that was persisting going to get out of SQL Server if the domain doesn't know anything about the external dependency? Remember, these arrows are the dependency between the data reader, or the adapter, if you like, and the domain. And there's no arrow pointing the other way. The domain is completely isolated. So is it possible that event sourcing and some ideas taken from DVD can step in and assist us with this? So In this scenario, then, a query would be received into the domain and announced. The data reader would be listening and responding to this query, servicing the query, and then sometime later, an aggregate. So there's a few things going in here, which I can explain a bit. An aggregate might say, or might actually realise it's in a sensible state, eventually in a sensible state, and announce its own state to whoever's interested. Just so happens that the user interface, the controller is also listening to what the domain has to say. And when it's been told that an aggregate is in a reasonable state following the execution of the query, then it sends the appropriate stuff back to web browser. So it's very disconnected. It's for a good reason. The kinds of things that live in the domain here, if any of the ideas of data connections, HTTP concepts, or anything like that started to leak into your domain, you'd end up with a very inflexible and painful thing to work with. And changing that would be, obviously, becomes quite a difficult thing to do. And I suppose with MTIA and with SOA, we get into that situation quite a lot. So here's another port. We don't have time to put any more on. So the domain is turned into some blob cloud thing, and we've got another external concern here, which is something to do with mails or something like that. So let's say, for example, some queries and commands are executed in the domain, and we've got to a state where we need to send an email out or announce something back to the outside world. We're not going to call out directly to something that understands SMTP. We're just going to announce that we've got something to share. And in the same way that we've got this arrangement here, an event would fire, the SMTP adapter would say, yes, I'm interested in that event. I better package up an email and send it to the SMTP server. So, what have I learned about hexagonal architecture? It's helped me to appreciate the difficulties you can get into if your dependency directions are a bit wrong. So if you're pointing to things which aren't that valuable to the function of the business at the time. So persistence is becoming a bit of an obsession for you. And that's a bit of a smell to me. And persistence is something that should happen when it needs to happen, but it shouldn't be necessarily something that the business is primarily concerned with. A lot of your business logic in here can live standalone on its own without any of the built-in adapters around it. So there are times when it's inappropriate to consider hexagonal architecture. There's a lot of crossover with other disciplines like DDD, CQRS, and event sourcing. And there's also, I find a lot of commonality between what hexagonal architecture offers as a pattern, if you like, and what I do when I'm writing object-oriented code, if I'm writing a class. So, first of all, on first point, when is it inappropriate? Well, if you don't have a domain, then you've got nothing to centralize. So if you've got an application that is primarily CRUDy, such as a Rails thing, I mean, I think this is one of the things that DHH came out with, wasn't it? That he couldn't understand why hexagonal architecture becomes such an interesting thing to people who do TDD, because with Rails, there's not much of a domain, to be honest. It's primarily CRUD-based stack. So for things where there's no clear and obvious domain to work with, then you're going to get yourself into a bit of a mess if you start to centralize stuff that doesn't need centralizing. Class cohesion and coupling is something that I've noticed when I'm working on a class. If I try to forget about all the external forces on a piece of business value, business module, and I just build a class based on what the business is expected to do, something to do with pricing or booking or anything like that, or buying or anything, then if I develop that class and it starts to grow and grow and grow, and its cohesion starts to look a bit iffy and it starts to become a very fat class, the first thing I want to do is start to break it out, do extract method, extract class, and so on. And of course, when you do that, the first thing you want to do is reverse the dependencies. You don't want that class that you've broken up to depend on any of the things that you've pushed outside of it. So you use your IOC tools to point everything back into the thing that you've broken up. So when I'm working with cohesion and coupling at the class level, it feels very much like when I'm working with a hexagonal arrangement, where I don't want my domain class, my domain component, aggregate or something like that, to start to get infected by all these external concerns. So I push them out and I invert the dependencies. You don't have to use an IOC tool, by the way, to do that. You go and use your favourite tools. So I like to call those micro-bounding contexts, because I think cohesion and coupling is like a bounding context on its own. The subjects of bounding context is a big thing. It's domain-driven design, mainly around domain-driven design, and I'll talk about that for a long time. But I do see a lot of bounding context stuff happening in hexagonal architecture. So there's a lot of crossover with the other interesting stuff. How much is important, how much we should use, how much it should influence us, that's up for discussion. Yeah, this was a much longer presentation, which I've managed to squeeze into about 10 minutes. I usually talk for about 30 minutes on it. So I've gone very fast. Has anybody got any questions? I can go back to some other slides if you want to talk about anything in particular.
I'm just not very clued up in this area, but is it kind of observers, listeners?